Hello and welcome to part 4, the final part in this series of All Preachers Great and Small. My name is Ken Calder and I'm connected with the Queensbury Baptist Church in Nottingham in the UK. As usual, I have a mix of personal stories, so for the next few minutes, join me for a view of life through the eyes of a young and inexperienced church minister. Now, a fish and chip shop hardly seems the place where a small miracle might occur, but it did. During the 1970s, Darlington was my home for 6 happy years. The town was famous for several reasons. It had a long association with trains, but it also boasted numerous chip shops, pubs and gas street lighting. Darlington was possibly one of the last towns in England to be upgraded to electric street lighting. Once a week, after the Bible study, I would frequent one very successful chip shop for a hot supper for my family. Their reputation was such that the queue would often spill out onto the pavements, even on cold, wet nights. I eventually reached the counter and put in my order. Just as that precious parcel of fish and chips was being shoved into my hands, a distraught young woman burst into the shop, wailing in agony. "Has anyone seen a small boy? We just moved into town. He slipped out of the front door and vanished into the night." Seeing our blank looks, that distraught woman quickly returned to those rain-lashed streets to continue the heartbreaking task of seeking her lost child. And I settled down in my car seat with that delicious warm takeaway beside me, slipping on my seatbelt and thinking to myself, "Home, James, the family's waiting for their supper." But suddenly, as I turned the key and gunned the engine, the wildest thought entered my mind. Find that child before you go home. And so began an amazing adventure. My hunger was forgotten. I found myself praying, "Oh God, help me to find this lost child." I turned away from home into a maze of unfamiliar streets, praying all the time. I turned left, turned right, then left again, and very soon I was lost myself and ready to give up. But just then, in a deserted, rain-soaked street, under a feeble gas lamp, I detected a movement. My car lights picked out this toddler, soaked to the skin, his baby blonde hair plastered to his head, and rain and tears mingling on his face. I slammed on the brakes, jumped out, and scooped up that exhausted infant. He snuggled up against me and promptly fell asleep. The little chap was soon reunited with his mum. And I arrived home with cold fish and chips, but a warm, thankful heart, because our God does answer prayer. While I was pastoring in Darlington, we advertised a lunchtime dialer prayer, and we manned the phone between midday and 2 p.m. The idea was to catch workers in their lunch break and to pray over their concerns. One afternoon, I answered a call to find myself in conversation with one particular man who eventually invited me to visit his home. So a few days later, I sat in his lounge listening to his problems. And he said this, he said, "I work the Northeast nightclubs as a comedy act. Everyone laughs at my jokes, but I'm always unhappy." We discussed his problems, and I presented Christ as his only answer. He embraced salvation, and we prayed the sinner's prayer together. And as we prayed, he whispered, "There's been no laughter in this house for months." So at the end of my prayer, I prayed, "Lord, fill this house with laughter." A few weeks later, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find a man jigging up and down on my front step with a look of perfect peace on his face. "It's me," he cried, "the comedian." He excitedly told me how his life had been changed, that Jesus was now so important to him, he would often stop his car at the roadside just to read his Bible. But last night, he said, my son and I were skylarking around in the home, and as I chased him upstairs, I suddenly realized the house was full of laughter. So there and then I sat down on the stairs and I thanked God for answered prayer. Another time I answered the telephone to find myself speaking to a newspaper reporter. She said, I've seen your posters in town and want to write a feature story about your telephone helpline. Can I come and see you? Next day, a bubbly young blonde appeared on the doorstep, accompanied by a middle-aged photographer. We're thinking, she said, of a centre page spread with photographs and comments from some of your callers. And as you believe in the laying on of hands for healing, perhaps you will say a prayer over me, just for our readers, you understand. Flash, flash. The photographer was in action as I went through the motions of praying over that blonde head. Inwardly, I was silently beseeching God to arrest this fun-loving female and place her in his church. Half an hour later, it was all over. Goodness, is that the time? This journalistic whirlwind tore off down the road, heading in the direction of her newspaper office. Some weeks later, some Christian circles were agog with the news. The blonde reporter, the delightful extrovert, had professed conversion. All her energies were now channeled into serving God. I spent several years in Darlington, where Handel's Messiah was performed annually at a huge rambling church in the town centre, quite close to our own church building. On this particular occasion, I was in two minds about attending because the very next night we were holding a special water baptismal service at our own church, and preparations were always a mammoth task. You see, our church building was quite old and the baptismal tank was antiquated. So you can certainly forget the words all mod cons. Nothing was on tap. First, the sunken tank under the pulpit had to be filled using a garden hosepipe. That took several hours. Then a gigantic heater element was introduced to warm the water, again requiring several hours. Finally, after the event, the tank had to be emptied manually. A bucket chain of volunteers bailing the water and pouring it down the nearest drain. Hours of manpower required to fill, empty, and dry out the tank before its cover could be replaced. Nevertheless, I decided that I could attend the performance of Messiah while also preparing for the baptismal service. However, I would need to slip out during the performance to nip to my own church to keep an eye on the water level as the tank filled up. When I arrived at the church performing Messiah, it was jam-packed, not an empty seat anywhere on the ground floor. Row after row of eager faces, and the same up in the spacious balcony. There was an overflow there too, people cramming the entrance and standing in the aisles. Yet in spite of all this, there were two empty seats in the front row of the balcony, either side of a glowing face, oblivious to all but the music. A tramp had managed to access the building, a heaving bundle of rags with grimy, gnarled hands, dirt-streaked head, rocking to the music and miming every movement of the choir conductor. That down and out was an ex-opera singer who'd fallen on hard times, a social outcast, lost in the music of Messiah. As the soloist's voice filled the air, he was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. I noted the irony of those empty seats either side of the vagrant. The vacant seats that no one cared to fill, they epitomized the very words being sung. I became so engrossed with the tramp's lovable antics that we reached the very end of the performance before I realised I'd failed to check the baptismal tank. I jolted into action, tore down the road to our church building. Oh dear, the tank was overflowing. The excess water was about to teach our pulpit carpet how to swim. Still, never fear. In the end, the day was saved. Just about. Well, that's it. We've come to the end of our series, All Preachers Great and Small. I do pray these true stories have been helpful and will inspire you to believe God for great things in your own personal life. And to that end, I leave you with two wonderful Bible verses to undergird your faith. Try reading, when you pray, Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20 and 21. Okay, thanks for joining me, and my thanks also to all those behind the scenes who pull the technical strings, enabling me to interface with you. Do look out for Queensbury Productions on YouTube and join us when you can. Keep safe, keep spiritual, and keep looking up. Bye.